The studio lights blazed down on the set of Stephen's late-night show, illuminating the familiar desk and the audience buzzing with anticipation. Tonight's guest was none other than Elon Musk, the tech titan whose name alone could ignite a firestorm of opinions. Stephen, ever the sharp-witted host, leaned back in his chair, his smile tight, almost performative, as Elon strode onto the stage. The handshake was brief, a flicker of tension passing between them, unnoticed by the crowd but palpable to anyone paying close attention. Elon settled into the guest seat, his posture relaxed yet commanding, while Stephen shuffled his notes, a glint of something unspoken in his eyes. The audience clapped, oblivious to the brewing storm. The conversation kicked off with the usual fare, Stephen probing Elon about his latest ventures, the billionaire responding with his trademark blend of confidence and dry humor. But beneath the surface, a current of unease rippled. Why had Stephen invited Elon tonight? Was it just another celebrity spotlight, or was there an agenda lurking behind those carefully curated questions? The host's tone shifted subtly as he steered the discussion toward Elon's personal life, a topic the tech mogul rarely entertained. The audience leaned in, sensing the pivot, while Elon's jaw tightened ever so slightly. Stephen mentioned Elon's children, a casual remark about family dynamics, but his words carried an edge, a deliberate nudge toward something deeper. What was Stephen fishing for? And why did Elon's eyes narrow just for a moment before he flashed a disarming grin? The room grew quieter as Stephen pressed on, his voice steady but laced with intent. He brought up Elon's estranged child, Vivian, who had publicly distanced herself from her father years ago. The host framed it as a light-hearted aside, but the subtext was unmistakable, a veiled accusation dangling in the air. Elon's smile faltered, replaced by a steely gaze that locked onto Stephen. The audience shifted uncomfortably, caught between curiosity and dread. Had Stephen planned this? All along? Was he about to peel back the polished veneer of Elon's public persona? The host leaned forward, his next words slicing through the tension like a blade, calling out Elon for what he deemed problematic views on race and identity, views he claimed had driven a wedge between father and child. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath as Elon's fingers gripped the armrests of his chair. The accusation hung there, raw and unfiltered, a match tossed onto dry tinder. Stephen sat back, satisfied, as if he'd just landed a decisive blow. But Elon didn't flinch, not yet. His silence was deafening, a coiled spring ready to snap. The audience couldn't look away, their eyes darting between the two men, sensing the collision course they were on. What would Elon say? Would he deflect or would he strike back? The stage was set, the battle lines drawn, and the night was about to unravel in ways no one, not even Stephen, could have predicted. The calm had shattered, and the storm was rolling in fast. The studio air thickened as Stephen's words settled over the room, his accusation of Elon's alleged racism and transphobia echoing off the walls. The host's expression was a mix of smugness and conviction, his posture rigid as he awaited a response. The audience, now fully alert, watched Elon with bated breath, their murmurs a low hum beneath the glaring lights. The billionaire's face was unreadable at first, a mask of calm that betrayed nothing, but his eyes burned with an intensity that sent a shiver through the front row. Stephen had thrown down the gauntlet, and the clock was ticking on how Elon would pick it up. Elon leaned forward, his movements deliberate, almost predatory, as he rested his elbows on his knees. The shift in his demeanor was subtle but seismic, a man shedding the casual charm he'd worn moments before. He began to speak, his voice low and measured, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. He didn't deny Stephen's claims outright, but instead turned the lens back on the host, questioning the evidence behind such a loaded charge. The audience stirred, some nodding in approval, others frowning in confusion, as Elon dissected Stephen's phrasing with surgical precision. He asked why a disagreement with his child's choices was being twisted into something sinister, his tone sharp yet eerily calm. Stephen, caught off guard by the counterattack, scrambled to regain control. He doubled down, his voice rising as he cited public statements Elon had made, framing them as proof of intolerance. He painted a picture of a father who couldn't accept his child's identity, a man whose wealth couldn't buy empathy. The crowd reacted, some clapping in support, others whispering in dissent, the room splitting down the middle. But Elon didn't waver. He interjected, his words gaining momentum, pointing out the hypocrisy of a host who preached inclusivity. While ambushing a guest on live television, the accusation stung, and Stephen's face flushed, a crack forming in his polished facade. The exchange escalated, each man digging in deeper, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of defiance. Stephen leaned into his moral high ground, gesturing animatedly as he recounted Vivian's public rejection of her father, implying Elon's views were the root cause. Elon shot back, his composure fraying at the edges, challenging Stephen to define the line between personal belief and public condemnation. The audience was riveted, their emotions swinging wildly as the argument intensified. Elon's hands clenched into fists, his restraint visibly thinning, while Stephen's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. The confrontation was no longer a debate, it was a firestorm, and neither man was backing down. The studio pulsed with raw energy as the clash between Stephen and Elon reached a fever pitch. The host, his confidence rattled by Elon's relentless pushback, gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles whitening under the strain. He tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, tossing out a half-hearted joke to lighten the mood. But the audience wasn't buying it. Their laughter was sparse, strained, a thin veneer over the unease that gripped the room. Elon, sensing the shift, straightened in his chair, his gaze locked on Stephen like a predator, sizing up its prey. The air crackled with anticipation, every eye glued to the stage. Elon's next move was calculated, a verbal grenade lobbed with precision. He pivoted away from defending himself and went on the offensive, questioning Stephen's credibility as a judge of character. He brought up the host's own history, a string of controversial monologues from years past that had sparked backlash but faded from public memory. The audience gasped, a wave of recognition rippling through the crowd. As Elon painted Stephen as a man who dodged accountability while wielding judgment like a weapon. Stephen's face twisted, a mix of anger and disbelief as he stammered to interrupt, but Elon pressed on, his voice rising with a controlled fury that silenced the room. The billionaire didn't stop there. He turned the spotlight on Stephen's tactics, accusing him of exploiting a father's private struggles for cheap ratings. He spoke of Vivian not as a prop in this circus, but as a person caught in a narrative Stephen had no right to rewrite. The crowd was split, some cheering Elon's raw honesty, others recoiling at the personal jab, but all were captivated. Stephen, visibly shaken, tried to reclaim the narrative, his voice sharp as he accused Elon of dodging the real issue, his supposed bigotry. But the words felt hollow now, a desperate grasp at authority that was slipping through his fingers. The breaking point came when Elon stood, a sudden motion that jolted the audience and froze Stephen mid-sentence. Towering over the desk, he didn't shout, didn't need to, his presence alone commanding the room. He delivered a final blow, a quiet, searing indictment of Stephen's sanctimony, suggesting the host's outrage was less about justice and more about self-righteous posturing. The studio fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in as Stephen sat there, mouth parted, unable to respond. The crew behind the cameras exchanged wide-eyed glances, the producer's voice crackling, through headsets urging a cut to commercial. The line had been crossed and the fallout was imminent. The studio plunged into an eerie stillness as Elon remained standing, his shadow stretching across the set like a storm cloud. Stephen, slumped in his chair, stared up at the billionaire, his usual quick wit buried beneath a stunned silence. The audience held its breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on every soul in the room. The cameras, still rolling despite the producer's frantic whispers, captured every second of the standoff, the lens zooming in on Stephen's ashen face and Elon's unyielding stare. No one dared move, not the crew, not the spectators, as, if the slightest sound might shatter the fragile tension, Elon slowly sat back down, his movements deliberate, a king reclaiming his throne after a battle won. He didn't speak, didn't need to, the silence itself a weapon sharper than any retort. Stephen fumbled with his notes, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to regain composure, but the damage was done. The audience could see it, the way his shoulders hunched, the way his eyes darted to the floor, avoiding Elon's gaze. The host had been stripped bare, his authority punctured by a guest who refused to play the scripted game. The crowd was restless now, some whispering among themselves, others sitting in rapt attention waiting for the next move. Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. The producer's voice grew hoarse in the crew's earpieces, demanding a commercial break. But the director hesitated, sensing the historic weight of the moment. Stephen finally spoke, his voice cracking as he attempted to pivot, suggesting they move on to lighter topics. But the words sounded feeble, a plea more than a command. Elon tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, and declined to respond, letting the host's desperation hang in the air. The audience picked up on it, their murmurs growing louder, a mix of shock and fascination rippling through the seats. Stephen's mask of control was gone, replaced by a man scrambling to salvage his dignity. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint hum of the studio lights and the occasional cough from the crowd. Elon leaned back, crossing his arms, his calm demeanor, a stark contrast to Stephen's unraveling. The power dynamic had flipped, and everyone knew it. The host tried once more, tossing out a weak barb about Elon's ego, but it landed flat, met with scattered chuckles that faded. Quickly, the billionaire's refusal to engage was deafening, a statement louder than any argument, and it left Stephen exposed, floundering in the wreckage of his own ambush. The stage was no longer his, and the clock was ticking toward a reckoning. The studio's atmosphere shifted, as the audience, once a passive backdrop, began to stir with purpose. Elon's unwavering calm and Stephen's faltering grip on the night ignited a spark among the seats, a restless energy that spread like wildfire. Whispers turned to murmurs, then to bold voices, as pockets of the crowd found their footing. Some clapped for Elon, their applause sharp and defiant, a signal of allegiance to the man who'd flipped the script. Others jeered Stephen, their disapproval cutting through the air, a chorus of discontent aimed at a host who'd overplayed his hand. The room was no longer a monolith. It was a battlefield, and the tide was turning. Stephen noticed the change, his eyes flicking nervously to the audience, searching for the loyal fans who'd carried him through years of late-night rain. But their faces were hard to read now, a mix of doubt and curiosity replacing the usual adoration. He forced a smile, thin and brittle, and tried to rally them with a quip about Elon's stubbornness, but the response was tepid, a smattering of polite. Laughs drowned out by a growing rumble of dissent. Elon, still seated, watched it unfold with a detached amusement, his silence fueling the crowd's momentum. The billionaire didn't need to speak. The people were doing it for him, their reactions a mirror to Stephen's crumbling facade. Woman in the third row stood, her voice piercing the din as she called out Stephen for dragging a family matter into the spotlight. Heads turned, nodding in agreement, and soon others joined her, their words overlapping in a chaotic swell of frustration. Stephen raised his hands, palms out, a gesture meant to calm, but it only fanned the flames. The audience wasn't his. Anymore they were splintering, some defending Elon's right to privacy, others accusing Stephen of performative virtue. The crew scrambled, unsure whether to cut the feed or let the unraveling play out, their indecision amplifying the disorder. Elon finally broke his silence, not with a shout but with a single cutting remark about the irony of a crowd turning on its shepherd. The line landed like a thunderclap, drawing cheers from his supporters and stunned gasps from Stephen's loyalists. The host's face reddened, his attempts to interject drowned out by the rising noise. He was losing them, not just the argument, but the very foundation of his show, and the realization etched itself into every line of his expression. The audience had become the judge, and their verdict was shifting against him, a wave he couldn't outrun. The studio descended into a maelstrom as the audience's rebellion reached its zenith, their voices a jagged symphony of support and scorn. Stephen sat at his desk, a lone figure adrift in the chaos, his once commanding presence reduced to a flicker under the weight of the crowd's judgment. Elon, seated opposite, exuded a quiet triumph, his eyes scanning the room with the cool detachment of a general surveying a conquered field. The cameras rolled on, capturing every agonizing second, the crew too paralyzed to intervene as the night spiraled beyond their control. Stephen's empire was crumbling, and the wreckage was live for all to see. The host made a final, desperate bid to reclaim the narrative, his voice rising above the clamor as he accused Elon of manipulating the audience with his silence. But the words rang hollow, a flailing attempt to shift blame that only deepened the hole he'd dug. The crowd roared back, some shouting him down, others laughing outright, their derision a knife twisting in his pride. A man near the back yelled that Stephen had lost his edge, a sentiment echoed by scattered cheers, and the host's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. Elon leaned forward, his expression unreadable, and delivered a single sentence, calm and lethal, about the dangers of preaching from a glass house. The room erupted, the applause for Elon drowning out Stephen's stammered reply. Stephen's humiliation was complete as the audience turned their backs, some literally, swiveling in their seats to face away from the stage. The gesture was spontaneous, brutal, a physical rejection that stripped him of his last shred of authority. He stared out at the sea of turned heads, his mouth opening and closing, no words coming. Elon rose again, this time to a standing ovation from half the room, his presence towering over the set. He didn't gloat, didn't need to. The victory was etched in Stephen's defeated posture, in the way the host's hands fell limp on the desk, papers forgotten. The producer finally found his voice, barking orders for a commercial break, but the damage was irreversible. Stephen's eyes met Elon's for a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement of the rout before dropping to the floor. The billionaire stepped toward the edge of the stage, shaking hands with a few emboldened fans, his every move a contrast to the host's collapse. The screen faded to black, but the image lingered, a fallen king and a rising conqueror, the night sealed in infamy. The studio lights flickered back on as the commercial break ended, but the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. Stephen sat behind his desk, a shell of the man who'd opened the show, his tie loosened, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cameras. Elon, by contrast, stood near the stage's edge, surrounded by a cluster of audience members who'd rushed forward, their hands outstretched, their voices a chorus of admiration. The crew scrambled to restore order, but the night belonged to the billionaire now, his triumph radiating through the room like a pulse. The chaos had settled into a clear verdict, and Stephen was no longer the arbiter. Elon returned to his seat, not out of obligation, but as a final act of command. His posture, relaxed yet regal. He addressed the audience directly, his voice steady, thanking them for seeing through the noise, for questioning the narrative thrust upon them. The words were simple, but they landed with weight, drawing cheers that shook the rafters. Stephen tried to interject, a weak attempt to wrap the segment, but his voice was lost in the swell, the crowd's focus locked on Elon. The host's hands trembled as he shuffled his notes, a futile gesture against the tide that had swept him aside. The audience wasn't just watching. They were witnessing a reclamation, a man rising above an ambush to claim the room as his own. The billionaire didn't linger on the attack, instead pivoting to a broader point about truth and scrutiny, his tone philosophical yet pointed. The crowd hung on every word, some nodding solemnly, others clapping in fervent agreement, their loyalty a shield around him. Stephen's face tightened, a flicker of resentment breaking through his defeat, but he stayed silent, knowing any retort would only bury him deeper. The cameras caught it all, the host's fall and Elon's ascent, a stark tableau of power redefined. The producer signaled the end, the show's runtime exhausted, but the energy lingered, a testament to the night's upheaval. As the credits rolled, Elon stood once more, shaking hands with the crew, his demeanor gracious yet unyielding. The audience rose too, their applause a thunderous farewell, while Stephen remained seated, a solitary figure dwarfed by the moment. The billionaire exited the stage, his head high, leaving behind a studio forever altered. Stephen stared after. Him then at the empty seats, the silence of his own making closing in. Elon had walked away not just unscathed, but victorious, the night a story of resilience, A confrontation met and mastered, its echoes destined to ripple far beyond the broadcast.